The setting: an empire of ice and silence. The thunder of Europe's battlefields was a deafening, constant drumbeat that dominated the global consciousness in the 1940s. From the pulverized ruins of Stalingrad to the smoke-choked skies over London, the war's front lines were carved into the densely populated heart of the globe. But far above this inferno, where the maps dissolved into vast stretches of white and blue, lay a theater of conflict so remote, so hostile, that its very existence was a whispered legend, the Forgotten Front. In this realm, the rules of conventional warfare disintegrated. There were no trenches, no strategic cities to conquer, and the enemy was often less the Allied soldier and more the inexorable, crushing force of nature itself. The battlefield was the frozen silence of the Arctic, a realm of perpetual twilight where the magnetic north held sway and temperatures plummeted to lethal extremes. Here, Germany fought a secret war. It was a conflict waged by small groups of highly trained specialists, often scientists or meteorologists dressed in naval gray, whose objectives were as cold and precise as the landscape they navigated. Their missions were not about conquering land, but about conquering the climate. They vanished into the expanse of the endless ice, small teams of men who carried the weight of the Third Reich's strategic future on their heavily insulated shoulders. For decades after the final peace treaty, the official histories ignored this front. The sheer isolation of the region rendered any firm confirmation impossible. For decades, stories whispered of hidden Nazi outposts buried beneath snow and stone. Tales of prefabricated shelters, cryptographic equipment, and high-powered radio masts, all silently entombed in the permafrost of Svalbard, Greenland, and Franz Josef Land. And for the longest time, no one believed them. They were dismissed as the fevered imaginings of explorers and the fantastical exaggeration of post-war intelligence reports, until the relentless thaw of the 21st century slowly began to reveal the rusting, spectral fragments of the Phantom Reich. The decision to commit resources to such a remote and unforgiving theater was not born of megalomania, but of strategic necessity rooted in the cold, hard science of meteorology. In 1941, as Germany invaded the Soviet Union, another race began, a race for the Arctic. The High Command, particularly within the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine Navy, understood a crucial fact of global climate: the vast, unpredictable weather systems that governed operations over Europe and the North Atlantic were overwhelmingly born in the Arctic Circle. Weather prediction was not a nicety, it was a matter of life and death, dictating the timing of U-boat Wolfpack attacks, the feasibility of bomber raids, and the movement of critical convoy traffic. The strategic pillars of Arctic control. To control the far north meant controlling the very conditions of battle, and the strategic advantages were immediate and interlocking. Weather prediction. Access to timely, accurate meteorological data from the source, the high Arctic, would give German forces an invaluable lead time over the Allies, enabling them to anticipate storms, fog, and clear skies across the North Atlantic and Western Europe. This data was crucial for the scheduling of the U-boat fleet hunting the supply lines to Britain. Radio interception and navigation. The desolate geography offered ideal, uninterrupted lines of sight for long-range radio signals. Control of isolated stations could facilitate advanced radio interception of Allied communications, and provide crucial navigational beacons for German aircraft and U-boats operating in the extreme north, where compasses were rendered unreliable by proximity to the magnetic pole. The sea routes of the Atlantic. Direct control over remote sections of the Arctic coast, particularly in Greenland and Norway, offered forward staging areas. These areas could be used for resupplying U-boats or launching long-range reconnaissance flights to scout the crucial Allied Arctic convoys, which ferried vital aid to the Soviet Union. The stakes were clear. The side that had the most accurate 3-day forecast often won the naval engagement. The daring plan. Operation Landsverrat Treason. The technical challenges were staggering. The stations would need to be entirely self-sufficient, capable of surviving sub-zero temperatures, months of darkness, and complete isolation from resupply for up to a year. Yet, the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine launched a daring plan: build secret weather and reconnaissance stations deep within the Arctic Circle. These were not to be large, permanent bases, but highly specialized, low-profile outposts. The most successful versions involved prefabricated sections, delivered rapidly by U-boat or modified reconnaissance aircraft. The typical station crew consisted of only 4 to 6 men: a lead meteorologist, a radio operator, a cook, and 1 or 2 armed guards. Their life expectancy was directly tied to the reliability of their equipment and the sheer tenacity of their will. They were not soldiers fighting for ground, but scientific saboteurs operating beyond the reach of conventional warfare. This operational requirement for extreme secrecy and extreme self-reliance gave birth to legendary missions like Operation Haudegen and Operation Edelweiss, missions that turned ordinary scientists into pioneers of a secret, freezing theater, defining the ultimate, silent battle for supremacy in the hostile North. The German war machine, facing relentless pressure on its European fronts by 1944, was still capable of executing missions of breathtaking audacity and logistical complexity. Operation Haudegen Cutlass stands as the most famous, and most successful, example of the Reich's commitment to its secret Arctic war, a mission that pushed human endurance and technological reliance to their absolute extremes. The mission was as cold as it was dangerous. It was launched not for conquest, but for data. By 1944, Allied forces controlled most of the weather reporting centers in the Atlantic, granting them a devastating advantage in planning naval and air operations. Haudegen was designed to penetrate the deepest flank of the Allied meteorological shield, landing on the edge of the world. In 1944, a small German team landed on Svalbard, a barren island halfway between Norway and the North Pole. Svalbard, an archipelago perpetually shrouded in mist and ice, was the perfect strategic location. Positioned directly in the path of vital weather systems forming over the Barents Sea, a successful station here could feed crucial 3 to 5 day forecasts back to U-boat command, potentially saving dozens of submarines from rough seas or guiding them directly into Allied convoy routes. The team was transported by a single U-boat, which also carried all the components of their survival: prefabricated hut sections, bags of coal, dehydrated food, high-octane gasoline for their generators, and the heart of their mission: a powerful, shortwave radio transmitter and sophisticated meteorological instruments. Their orders: establish weather station Haudegen, and survive. The landing itself was an ordeal. Dragging tons of equipment across slick, uneven ice and gravel beaches under the constant, unnerving glare of the summer midnight sun required brutal, physical labor. The team, led by meteorologist Dr. Wilhelm Deeg, were forced to work around the clock, battling sub-zero winds and the ever-present threat of polar bears. Every man understood the gravity of failure. In this environment, a broken radio, a failed generator, or a breached bunker meant death. The Ice Fortress. The construction prioritized stealth and protection against the environment. They built bunkers beneath the ice, camouflaged from the sky, utilizing the desolate, rocky terrain and natural snowdrifts to hide the small, low-profile structures. The main living quarters and the radio room were heavily insulated and interconnected by tunnels to prevent the lethal exposure to the elements during the months of perpetual darkness. The most critical component was the radio mast, tall enough to broadcast effectively but needing to be disguised against the keen eyes of Allied reconnaissance pilots. Once established, the daily routine became a scientific, life-and-death liturgy, stepping outside into the blinding glare or the utter blackness, launching weather balloons, logging pressure and temperature, and then returning to the relative warmth of the cramped radio bunker. From this frozen, minuscule outpost, the team began its silent, vital work, transmitting meteorological data to Germany until the war's very last days. Day after day, they fed the Reich the critical forecasts that aided U-boat movements and Luftwaffe operations, justifying the immense risk and resource expenditure of the secret Arctic War. Their success was a testament to the resilience of German scientific planning and the sheer willpower of the men who volunteered to live and work at the ends of the earth. The ultimate narrative arc of Operation Haudegen is one of abandonment, a story of men clinging to duty long after the cause they served had ceased to exist. As the Reich collapsed, the Arctic team was forgotten. By April 1945, the communications from Berlin were becoming increasingly erratic, then terrifyingly non-existent. The airwaves that had once pulsed with encrypted orders and vital acknowledgments from the Siegfriedsleutung Naval Warfare Command fell silent. The team members, isolated in their ice bunker, knew only that the situation in Europe was dire, but they could not grasp the scale of the catastrophe. Their world was Svalbard, and the only reality was the next scheduled weather report. Cut off from all communication, surrounded by hundreds of miles of frozen ocean, they kept working, unaware that Berlin was already in ruins. Their daily duty, the meticulously scheduled transmission of weather data, became an anchor in a world that was dissolving around them. They maintained their routines with fanatical dedication, winding the clocks, fueling the generator, recording the instruments. The silence of the radio room, punctuated only by the crackle of static, was a constant, growing psychological torture. They sent their reports out into the ether, following the precise protocols established years earlier, but received no reply. The weeks turned into months. May arrived, and still they worked. June, July. The war in Europe was over, a historical fact signed into law on Allied documents, but for the 6 men on Svalbard, the conflict continued in the vacuum of their radio silence. For months after the war ended, they continued transmitting. The sheer resilience of the team, the dedication to a defined mission, superseded common sense. They were soldiers and scientists whose primary order was to transmit data until otherwise commanded. Without a formal order of surrender or recall, the mission was ongoing. They were guarding an empty post for a sovereign that no longer existed. The silence that surrounded them, the quiet isolation of the Arctic wilderness, was echoed by the silence on the airwaves, a chilling confirmation of their worst fears. To them, the war had no end. Only silence. It was only later in the summer of 1945, when a Norwegian whaler happened upon their location, that the true historical anachronism of Operation Haudegen was revealed. On September 4, 1945, nearly 4 months after VE Day, the team was formally contacted and finally surrendered to a Norwegian vessel, becoming the last organized German unit to surrender in World War II. Their act was a final, poignant footnote to the secret Arctic War, a testament to the fact that on the frozen, forgotten front, the fighting had continued until literally commanded to stop. While the global capitulation of the Third Reich in May 1945 signaled the end of hostilities across Europe and the Atlantic, the bureaucratic machinery of the Allied powers remained cautiously active. Naval intelligence centers continued to monitor the vast, crackling airwaves, listening for echoes of the conflict, for rogue U-boats, isolated garrisons, or any lingering threat that had yet to receive or acknowledge the final order. The Allied forces understood that the Arctic, the realm of perpetual twilight and absolute secrecy, was the most likely place for a phantom presence to persist. The signal from the void. In September 1945, Allied radio operators picked up faint German signals from the far north. The transmissions were not the furious bursts of U-boat traffic or the high-volume chatter of an operational base. They were short, highly structured, and meticulously formatted. Routine meteorological reports, pressure, wind speed, temperature, and cloud cover, all coded according to standard Kriegsmarine protocol. The timing was precise, following a schedule that had been irrelevant for months. It was a mechanical, ghostly adherence to duty, transmitted into a void that no one should have been listening to anymore. The operators at the receiving stations, based in Iceland, Scotland, and Canada, were stunned. At first, they thought it was a trick, a sophisticated deception campaign launched by a hardline rogue element, perhaps a fanatical U-boat captain or a holdout Nazi scientist attempting to lure Allied patrols into danger. The idea that an organized, disciplined German military unit was still operational 4 months after VE Day seemed preposterous, an insult to the finality of the Allied victory. However, the sheer consistency and mundane content of the messages, whether data, not propaganda or military orders, convinced naval intelligence that the source was genuine, albeit surreal. The coordinates were traced. A remote, uninhabited sector of the Svalbard archipelago, a desolate coastline known for ice, fog, and ferocious storms. A Norwegian sealing vessel, armed and accompanied by a small contingent of naval personnel, was dispatched to investigate the source of the persistent, anachronistic broadcast. The surreal scene at Haudegen. The expedition reached the coordinates after a harrowing journey through the Barents Sea. As they approached the designated area, they found no evidence of a conventional military garrison, no heavy fortifications, no anti-aircraft batteries. Instead, they discovered a small, expertly camouflaged cluster of low-profile huts and bunkers, half buried in the scree and snow, its radio mast rising like a skeletal finger into the vast Arctic sky. The station was clearly operational, emitting a thin wisp of smoke from its stovepipe. This was Weather Station Haudegen. The scene that greeted the boarding party was one of utter, historical surrealism. But when an expedition arrived at Svalbard, they found a surreal sight. Emerging from the cramped, heavily insulated bunkers were 6 men. They were exhausted, their faces burned by the Arctic sun and wind, their heavy naval coats stained and worn, and their beards long and matted. A team of exhausted, frostbitten men standing at attention. They were the meteorologist Dr. Wilhelm Deeg, his radio operator, and the rest of the small crew, all drawn up in a formal line outside their isolated sanctuary. Their physical state spoke of an incredible ordeal of deprivation, constant cold, and profound psychological strain, yet their bearing was rigidly military. They had maintained their discipline through the long, silent months, preparing for this exact moment, the moment they would finally receive a formal order, even if that order came in the form of an enemy patrol. The last surrender. The Norwegian officer, stunned by the formal posture of the men, approached the lead meteorologist, Dr. Deeg. The exchange was brief, professional, and utterly devoid of hostility. Deeg, holding a sidearm, a German K-98 rifle, that was more a symbol of authority than a serious threat, requested the official status of the Reich. He was informed, unequivocally, that the war had been over since May. With the news confirmed, Deeg made the final, poignant decision. He knew they were the last. In a moment that was both heartbreakingly loyal and historically absurd, he prepared his final formal act. The moment was etched forever in the history of the war's conclusion. Dr. Deeg stepped forward, placed his service sidearm on the ground, and rendered a final, crisp salute to the Norwegian officer, the representative of the victorious Allies. They were the last men of the German Wehrmacht to stand down. They became the last Germans to surrender in World War II. The scene was a dramatic, definitive closing to the Forgotten Front. The men of Haudegen had been defeated not by superior firepower, but by a combination of the sheer logistics of the Arctic environment and the comprehensive collapse of the political structure they served. They were an anachronism, loyal to a chain of command that ended in a ruined bunker in Berlin months earlier, proving that for some, the war truly ended only when they were told it was over. The surrender of Operation Haudegen was not merely the end of a single mission, it was the final, turning of a key that unlocked a vast, terrifying chapter of the secret war. The 6 exhausted men led Allied intelligence directly into the chilling magnitude of Germany's Arctic endeavor. The documents, maps, and radio logs recovered from the Svalbard base offered undeniable proof that the Frozen Front was not an isolated operation, but a comprehensive, well-funded network spanning the highest latitudes. Haudegen wasn't the only one. The interrogation of Dr. Deeg and his team, coupled with the captured cryptographic keys, allowed Allied intelligence, specifically Norwegian, British, and American naval forces, to piece together a secret map of German infiltration. They discovered a chain of code names: Bassgeiger, Base Fiddler, Schatzgraber, Treasure Hunter, Edelweiss, and a host of temporary hydrological outposts. The Third Reich, while facing total collapse in the south, had established a continuous, albeit fragile, ring of surveillance and logistical support around the top of the world. The geography of desperation. The secret war was fought across a geographical canvas of immense scale and complexity. Across Greenland, Franz Josef Land, and even northern Canada, other secret weather outposts and U-boat refueling points were discovered. The types of outposts varied according to their specific strategic function, each one a micro-society clinging to existence in the planet's deadliest climate. High-frequency weather stations, e.g., Bassgeiger, Greenland. These were the most common and vital, equipped with complex radios and meteorological gear. Their sole purpose was the continuous transmission of forecasts, often positioned on the Greenland coast where crucial Atlantic weather fronts originated. These often used prefabricated aluminum huts, designed to be assembled rapidly by the U-boat crews who dropped them off. U-boat and naval resupply points, e.g., coastal Norway, Baffin Bay, less frequent but more heavily armed. These were hidden caches of fuel, torpedoes, and fresh water, sometimes equipped with basic repair sheds. These points were critical for extending the operational range of U-boats operating against the Murmansk and Archangel convoys, or scouting the distant Canadian coastline. Radio intercept and hydrographic stations. Highly specialized teams, often equipped with advanced direction-finding equipment, used the silent, clear air of the Arctic to listen in on Allied radio traffic and track the movement of polar ice packs, crucial for planning naval movements. Encounters with ghosts. The Allied expeditions sent to investigate these locations in the late summer and fall of 1945 were often anticlimactic, yet deeply unsettling. They were voyages into the ghost stations of a dying empire, encounters with the sudden, chaotic remnants of abandonment. Many had been abandoned in panic, leaving behind frozen weapons, maps, and radio logs. The scenes discovered by the Allied patrols, primarily Norwegian patrols backed by British intelligence, were eerie testaments to the power of the Arctic environment. Franz Josef Land, Schatzgraber. This station provided a particularly chilling scene. The team had been evacuated in the summer of 1944 after consuming contaminated polar bear meat, suffering severe illness. The rescue U-boat arrived just in time, but the scene left behind suggested immediate, desperate flight. Allied investigators found half-eaten meals frozen solid on tables, scientific reports incomplete and scattered, and equipment rusting rapidly. A frozen rifle leaned against a wall, its action seized by ice and rust. The feeling was not one of military defeat, but of a biological and environmental rout. Eastern Greenland, Edelweiss. Here, the evidence pointed to a swift, late-war evacuation as Allied air patrols became too frequent. Investigators found fully stocked pantries and generators only recently depleted of fuel. Maps were pinned to the walls with meticulous weather plots, abruptly ending in the spring of 1945. The sense was of an operation cut short, not by defeat, but by the physical impossibility of continuous resupply. The sites became historical exhibits the moment they were discovered, time capsules preserved by the intense, sterilizing cold. What they revealed was a pattern of immense logistical strain, technological frailty, and profound, psychological isolation. The average station life was often less than a year. Mechanical failure, illness, or enemy discovery guaranteed termination. The war of timing. The ultimate strategic lesson gleaned from the Arctic network was that it was a hidden front, a war fought not with bullets, but with temperature and timing. The Germans were not trying to conquer the Arctic, they were trying to control the data flow that originated there. Intelligence as munitions. Every successful weather report transmitted from the Arctic was worth more than a conventional barrage. A timely forecast of fog over the Grand Banks could allow a U-boat pack to safely cross a heavily patrolled area. A prediction of clear skies could trigger a reconnaissance flight over a key convoy route. The entire operation was a high-leverage gambit to gain a few hours' edge in a conflict where the margins of victory were razor-thin. The unbeatable enemy. The Arctic was the neutral, overwhelming participant in the conflict. German ingenuity could build a radio and a bunker, but it could not defeat the relentless cold, the logistical strain, and the sheer isolation. The stations ultimately failed because the Arctic refused to be domesticated by the Reich, consuming resources and demanding a continuous, massive supply chain that the collapsing German state could no longer afford. The discovery of the Arctic network redefined the global scope of World War II. It revealed a silent, scientific conflict, fought by a handful of dedicated men against the world's most hostile environment, all to capture the elusive prize of the weather forecast. The outposts, now empty and rusting monuments to desperation, remain the starkest evidence of the lengths the German High Command went to in their final, futile struggle for strategic dominance. Decades passed. The fury of the European war receded into history, becoming the subject of documentaries and textbooks. The Arctic front, however, remained a niche mystery, largely confined to specialized naval archives and the quiet, persistent queries of historians. The official narrative concluded with the orderly surrender of Howdagen and the swift dismantling of the known, abandoned sites. The severe, shifting ice of the far north proved to be a far more effective warden of secrets than any military guard. The return of the curious. As the 20th century closed, and as modern scientific research and extreme adventure tourism began to push deeper into the high latitudes, a new kind of visitor arrived in the German Forgotten Front. These were not Allied soldiers, but climate scientists, geologists, and hardened Arctic explorers, utilizing satellite imagery and GPS to penetrate areas previously deemed inaccessible. Years later, Arctic explorers stumbled upon the remains of more outposts, not the orderly, relatively intact bases like Howdagen that had been deliberately left behind, but chaotic, deeply buried sites that had been lost to sudden storms, catastrophic mechanical failures, or hasty, panicked evacuations in the face of the collapsing Reich. These were the true ghost stations, sites abandoned not by order, but by desperation. The rediscovery was often accidental, a glint of unusual metal in a melting ice sheet, a geometric shape too perfect to be natural emerging from a thaw, or an anomaly detected by ground-penetrating radar. What they found beneath the tundra and the permafrost was a horrifyingly preserved glimpse into a moment frozen in time. The archaeology of desperation. The sites were monuments to human ambition and ultimate defeat. Explorers crawled into subterranean spaces, using heavy machinery and delicate hand tools to excavate what the elements had swallowed. Steel bunkers. The architectural remains were formidable, heavily reinforced steel bunkers, designed for extreme longevity, often found twisted by the inexorable creep of the glacier but fundamentally intact. The interiors, lit by the weak beam of a modern headlamp, were time capsules, cramped living quarters where uniforms still hung on pegs and books lay open on frozen tables. The air, devoid of humidity for half a century, held the faint, unsettling scent of old leather and stale tobacco. Rotting supplies. Outside, the landscape was littered with rotting supplies, frozen bags of coal, rusting tins of food, some of which were still technically edible, and tangled masses of radio wire. The logistical struggle of the men was etched into every remaining artifact, the immense expenditure required to deliver tons of supplies to the middle of nowhere, only for it to be left to the elements. Frozen corpses preserved by time. Most chillingly, the eternal cold had served as a meticulous embalmer. In some sites, explorers discovered frozen corpses preserved by time. These were not the casualties of combat, but men who had succumbed to accident, illness, or exposure. A man found slumped over a malfunctioning generator, his face a silent mask of frostbite, another discovered in his bunk, a victim of a rapid cold weather illness. Their clothing, identity tags, and even the expressions on their faces were chillingly intact, forcing the modern explorer into a direct, visceral confrontation with the human cost of the Arctic War. The unspoken mission. The recovered artifacts offered material proof of the network's existence, but some items suggested a far more unsettling purpose than merely transmitting weather data. Some sites still contained sealed crates marked with swastikas, preserved by a combination of heavy waterproofing and the Arctic cold. These crates were often found in the deepest, most secure parts of the bunkers, clearly intended for long-term storage or hidden for later retrieval. When forced open, the contents were sometimes cryptographic equipment or specialized navigational instruments, but other times they were biological samples, chemical components, or highly specialized research equipment not immediately applicable to meteorological science. This led to the revival of a darker, persistent myth that had long haunted post-war conspiracy circles, that the Arctic was more than just a frontline weather station. The sheer difficulty and expense of the logistical chain suggested a goal beyond merely predicting fog over the Atlantic. And others showed evidence of biological experiments, hinted at by specialized freezing equipment, vials of unknown substances, and meticulous field notes relating to polar fauna and human adaptation to extreme cold. The speculation among the modern investigators was immediate and grim. Adaptation research. Were the scientists studying extreme cold adaptation for future military applications? Was the research tied to the high altitude, freezing conditions encountered by Luftwaffe pilots? The Wunderwaffe myths. More darkly, was the Arctic intended as a remote, secure testing ground for advanced, secret weaponry or biological agents that the Reich deemed too sensitive to develop in war-torn Europe? The evidence was circumstantial, but profoundly disturbing. The presence of specialized, non-meteorological equipment hinted that the Arctic outposts were not just reporting the weather, but studying the environment itself for strategic advantage, perhaps even working on radical survival techniques or specialized, cold weather warfare programs. The relics beneath the ice thus offered a final, profound lesson. The Arctic might have been more than just a weather front. It was a secret laboratory, a fortress of last resort, and a dark final frontier for the Third Reich. It represented the desperate, final effort to harness the extreme corners of the globe for military dominance, a chilling, frozen legacy that continues to emerge, piece by rusting piece, from the silent depths of the endless ice. For over 70 years, the story of the Arctic outposts, the phantom transmissions, the frostbitten surrender, the strange biological samples, remained submerged in the cold water of historical skepticism. The High Command had buried the shame of its failure, and the permafrost had provided the ultimate cover. Yet, the relentless march of climate change and the persistent curiosity of a new generation of scientists guaranteed that the secrets of the Forgotten Front could not remain entombed forever. The Thaw and the Sentinel. The final, definitive chapter of the Arctic network began not with a military expedition, but with a scientific one. In 2016, Norwegian scientists rediscovered one of these bases, likely on the shores of Svalbard or Franz Josef Land, regions now melting faster than at any point in recorded history. The scientists, often tracking receding ice lines or monitoring changes in permafrost, found an anomaly, a section of coastline that contained structures far too regular and resistant to weather to be natural formations. The site, later identified as one of the deep cover meteorological stations, lay exposed by the receding glacier, Its entrance, a thick, steel-reinforced door designed to withstand the crushing weight of snow, finally yielding to the modern air. Entering the bunker was akin to stepping through a dimensional curtain into the last days of 1944. The interior was a meticulously preserved, if fragile, time capsule. The atmosphere was cold, heavy, and silent. The power of the Arctic to preserve had held back the corrosion of time, offering a stunning, detailed look at the life of the forgotten sentinel. The steel-lined walls still held the faded paint of the Kriegsmarine gray. The site was still filled with wartime documents and decaying equipment. On a small wooden table, maps lay unrolled, their edges curling, showing the careful, hand-drawn lines of long-range weather trajectories. Radio logs, meticulously filled in with ciphered entries, offered a final, silent record of data transmitted into a war that had already ended. In the living quarters, rusted but recognizable K-98 rifles leaned against the wall, alongside empty tins of preserved rations and personal items, a worn leather glove, a German-language paperback novel, and perhaps, a photograph of a loved one in a frame. The unspoken warning, the excitement of the historical find rapidly gave way to serious alarm. The scientific team was not prepared for the contaminants that had been preserved alongside the historical artifacts. The extreme nature of the mission had required materials and systems that were inherently dangerous. Radiation and biological hazards forced its closure. The hazards were a chilling realization of the extreme effort the Reich had committed to this front. The contamination likely stemmed from several sources: chemical and low-level radioactive contamination. The generators that powered the sophisticated radio equipment and heaters often relied on corrosive, unstable fuels or high-density battery cores that, over 70 years, had decayed into toxic sludge, contaminating the immediate soil and air. There was also the lingering suspicion that high-powered directional antennae or specialized atmospheric research equipment may have utilized low-level radiological sources, now leaking into the environment. The site quickly transitioned from an archaeological treasure to an environmental liability. The hazards were deemed too pervasive and too unpredictable to allow for safe, protracted salvage operations. To attempt a full decontamination effort would risk catastrophic disruption of the site, potentially releasing the dangerous materials into the sensitive Arctic ecosystem. The icy tomb. The final, decisive order came from the Norwegian government and international environmental agencies. The base, already a ghost, was to be officially reinterred and abandoned. The entrance was sealed with concrete and reinforced steel, and the immediate surrounding area was cordoned off with specialized signage, warning of the biochemical danger within. The latitude and longitude were placed under official watch, and the area was declared off-limits, an icy tomb for a forgotten mission. The ultimate fate of the Forgotten Front was not a military parade or a museum exhibition, but a cold, final closure. The site had served its purpose, enduring the war in the ensuing decades only to be defeated, in the end, by its own inherent toxicity and the melting climate. Yet, its discovery resonated across the world. The preserved bunker, now a sealed monument, was the irrefutable, physical final proof that the desperate, whispered legends had been true all along. The Third Reich had indeed committed men and resources to the edge of the world, fighting a silent, scientific war against the weather itself. The chilling, frozen outpost, a scar on the vast, white canvas of the Arctic, stands as the definitive monument to the most remote and mysterious theater of World War II.